A hand raises in a quiet room, pointing out a subtle moral flaw in a colleague's casual speech, shifting the air instantly. The brain is not seeking justice here, but is actually regulating a deep internal fear by seizing a sudden, visible high ground. This frantic need to be the most righteous person in the room hides a cold, survival-based machinery that few dare to name. The individual stands in a crowded square, shouting a slogan with a rhythmic intensity that mirrors a heartbeat, seeking a sense of total belonging. In the office cafeteria, a conversation halts abruptly because one person has framed a simple preference as a grave violation of a shared moral code. The mechanism is called moral coercion, which allows a person to exert significant power over a group without ever appearing to be a traditional aggressor. Observe the timing of the intervention, which usually occurs when the individual feels their own social status slipping or their personal relevance beginning to fade. By adopting the language of the wounded, the brain bypasses the usual defenses of the collective, making any disagreement appear as a form of cruelty. A screen glows in a dark bedroom, where a finger taps out a public condemnation of a stranger, providing a sudden rush of neurochemical safety. The physical distance of the digital world amplifies the effect, allowing the individual to strike at targets without ever facing the heat of human eyes. Notice how the person never suggests a private conversation, but always chooses the most visible platform to ensure the maximum level of social compliant debt. The mask is one of selfless devotion, yet the eyes remain fixed on the metrics of engagement, calculating the exact reach of their virtuous public display. In a coffee shop, a young man explains to his friend why a specific word choice is harmful, his posture expanding as the friend shrinks back. The friction in the air is palpable, as the friend realizes that the relationship has been traded for a moment of sharp, intellectualized social dominance. The individual does not see the person across from them, but only a set of ideas that must be corrected to maintain a personal hierarchy. This masking process is highly sophisticated, using the aesthetic of care to hide a primitive drive for control over the immediate social environment of others. When the group complies, the individual feels a temporary relief, as the environment has been successfully bent to their own specific, rigid psychological will. If the group resists, the individual intensifies the moral framing, casting themselves as a lonely martyr in a world that refuses to see the light. During a holiday dinner, a relative is silenced by a sharp lecture on historical guilt, the speaker's voice rising to a pitch of absolute certainty. The meal continues in a heavy silence, where the speaker feels a sense of triumph that is actually just a deep, fearful emotional isolation. The brain has learned that being right is a more effective shield than being liked, especially when the world feels increasingly unpredictable and very dangerous. We see this pattern in the way certain topics are guarded with a fierce, verbal aggression that discourages any form of nuance or genuine human curiosity. The individual acts as a gatekeeper of truth, deciding who is allowed to speak and which thoughts are considered safe for the rest of the group. This is not a failure of character, but a highly tuned regulation system that uses the collective's empathy as a host for its own survival needs. The timing of the outrage often reveals the internal state, as the most vocal protests usually follow a moment of personal insignificance or private failure. By attaching the self to a massive, global cause, the brain inflates the ego, granting it a weight that it cannot achieve on its own merit. A woman posts a photo of her protest sign, checking the notifications every few seconds to verify that her existence still holds a moral value. She is not thinking of the victim she claims to represent, but is instead feeding a hungry void that demands constant, external, and virtuous validation. The machinery of activism provides the perfect cover, as criticizing the behavior is framed as criticizing the cause itself, creating a perfect, closed loop. The individual becomes untouchable, wrapped in the armor of a higher purpose that justifies any level of interpersonal coldness or calculated social manipulation. The origins of this rigid armor are found in the early years, where the child discovered that a loud, moral cry was the only protection. If you're still watching, you probably notice things most people miss. You question behavior. You look beneath the surface. If that sounds like you, subscribe. This channel was made for minds like yours. A child breaks a rule in a silent house, watching the parents trade a moment of warmth for a cold, judging withdrawal of love. The nervous system records the drop in temperature, learning that a single deviation from the family's moral script leads to a terrifying, total social exile. The mechanism of ethical perfectionism begins to form here, as the child realizes that being good is the only way to remain safely visible. In a schoolyard, a young girl observes a peer being mocked, joining the chorus of shame to ensure the finger of judgment never points. She learns that the safest place in any conflict is behind the shield of the accuser, where the fear of being targeted is momentarily silenced. Ambiguity becomes a threat to the young brain, which requires a rigid set of black and white rules to navigate a very volatile emotional landscape. The child sacrifices their own messy, authentic impulses for a curated, virtuous performance that satisfies the demands of the powerful adults in the room. This is a survival trade-off, where the spontaneity of the self is bartered for the predictability of a highly moralized and very narrow identity. By age 10, the individual has mastered the art of the correct opinion, using it to gain favor and to avoid the pain of isolation. The brain imprints the feeling of righteousness as a primary safety signal, linking the act of moral correction to a deep sense of biological security. A teenager sits in a classroom, noticing a teacher's bias and calling it out with a sharp, performative edge that wins the respect of peers. The rush of adrenaline is addictive, as the brain discovers that a moral strike can instantly elevate a person's rank within a competitive social group. The individual is not seeking a better world, but is instead reinforcing a defensive wall that was built in the shadow of a cold nursery. Every act of public activism in adulthood is a reverberation of that early, desperate need to be seen as beyond reproach by a judging authority. The subconscious prison is constructed from the bars of should and must, leaving no room for the complex reality of a fallible, human existence. In a university hall, a student writes a manifesto that condemns the very institutions that they are currently using to gain a high status. The contradiction is invisible to the individual because the brain is only focused on the immediate, protective utility of the virtuous and loud stance. The nervous system remains stuck in a state of high alert, perpetually scanning the horizon for any sign of a moral lapse in the surrounding group. The person becomes a hunter of flaws, because every flaw found in another is a confirmation of their own, precarious and hard-won moral safety. This conditioning creates a person who cannot tolerate the gray areas of life, viewing any compromise as a betrayal of their own, fragile survival strategy. The individual believes they are fighting for the future, but they are actually just relitigating the battles of a childhood that demanded a perfect mask. A young professional enters a meeting, armed with a list of grievances that frame their own lack of progress as a systemic moral failure. The mechanism allows the brain to bypass the pain of personal accountability, shifting the burden of failure onto a much larger and more abstract target. The machinery is now fully integrated into the personality, operating with a speed and a precision that the conscious mind cannot easily see or stop. The person lives in a world of constant, low-level conflict, where every interaction is a test of their own, carefully constructed and very brittle virtue. The origin of the scream is a whisper of fear that was never heard, now amplified into a roar that demands the world's total attention. The individual is trapped in a loop of righteousness, unable to see that the weapon they carry is also the weight that keeps them down. The childhood learning has become a lifelong cage, where the only way to feel alive is to be the one who points the finger. A professional meeting dissolves into a tense silence, after one participant frames a minor budgetary dispute as a deep-seated lack of compassion for the poor. The colleagues look at their laps, sensing the sudden shift from a practical problem to a moral battlefield where any dissent is now a social risk. This mechanism is social hijacking, where the individual uses a universal struggle to bypass the normal, democratic friction of a healthy and balanced working group. In a modern relationship, a partner reacts to a forgotten chore by lecturing the other on the gendered history of labor, creating an unbridgeable distance. The coldness is immediate, as the accused partner realizes they are no longer speaking to a lover, but to a judge with a very long memory. The individual does not feel the friction because their brain is too busy bathing in the warm, chemical glow of being the more enlightened person. Modern social dynamics reward this behavior with a terrifying efficiency, as the group would rather comply than be labeled as a bigot or a fool. You are not a warrior for the oppressed, but a person who has discovered that morality is the most effective way to quiet a room. The identity-shattering truth is that your activism is not a gift to the world, but a tax you levy on everyone who dares to know you. In a friendship, a woman corrects her friend's phrasing of a personal tragedy, turning a moment of shared grief into a cold, grammatical lesson in power. The friend pulls away, realizing that their vulnerability has been harvested for a quick, virtuous win by a person they once trusted with their heart. The individual perceives this distance as a sign of their own moral superiority, rather than a direct result of their own exhausting and constant psychological aggression. Power structures in the digital age amplify this, as the most offended person is often granted the most authority over the speech of the entire collective. The brain identifies this trend and adapts, learning to find offense where none was intended to ensure it stays at the top of the social hierarchy. A manager uses the language of inclusion to dismiss a hardworking employee who challenged a bad decision, framing the challenge as a threat to safety. The mechanism allows the individual to be a bully while maintaining the public reputation of a saint, a duality that the brain finds incredibly soothing. Modern environments are the perfect laboratory for this dysfunction, as they prioritize the appearance of virtue over the messy reality of genuine human competence. The individual lives in a state of perpetual moral combat, where every lunch, email, and casual greeting is an opportunity to re-establish their dominant, virtuous rank. Others begin to walk on eggshells, a physical manifestation of the psychological minefield that the individual has successfully planted in every shared social space. This social expression is a sophisticated form of masking, where the primitive drive to be alpha is disguised as a selfless desire to be helpful. The friction felt by the group is the sound of a human connection being crushed under the weight of a very rigid and very loud ideology. The individual is increasingly lonely, yet they blame this loneliness on a world that is not yet ready for their high level of moral clarity. The machinery of the self is now fully externalized, using the social group as a mirror to reflect back a version of the self that is perfect. The coldness is the only thing that is real, a byproduct of a brain that has traded empathy for the safety of a very sharp moral edge. A thumb swipes rapidly across a glass screen, pausing only to deliver a sharp, moral rebuke to a stranger's 30-second video about their morning. The digital architecture has perfected the delivery of moral performance, stripping away the cooling effect of a human face and a shared physical space. Technology creates an invisible incentive structure, where the most aggressive moral stance is rewarded with the highest level of social visibility and algorithmic favor. The psychological cost is a state of permanent hypervigilance, as the individual must constantly update their vocabulary to remain at the moral vanguard. Maintaining the mask in a digital age requires a total abandonment of private nuance, as one wrong, can dismantle a decade of virtuous construction. In a quiet apartment, a person deletes a sincere thought because it does not align perfectly with the current, loud orthodoxy of their online group. The safety of the behavior is actually a cage, where the individual is now a prisoner of the very audience they sought to dominate. Modern culture has made this pattern invisible by rebranding the drive for social power as a selfless commitment to a global, digital justice. The brain is exhausted by the constant need to perform, yet it fears that stopping the performance will lead to an immediate, digital death. A woman feels a flicker of doubt about a popular outrage, but she posts the required black square anyway to avoid the silent judgment. The tension increases as the gap between the internal doubt and the external display becomes a wide, aching chasm of deep and silent resentment. This amplification turns every citizen into a voluntary surveillance officer, where the unseen machinery of the self is now a public, digital utility. The mask is no longer a choice, but a requirement for survival in a landscape where the wrong thought is a permanent, searchable record. We see this in the way corporate logos shift with the seasons, a cynical mimicry of the individual's own desperate, survival-based moral pivot. The individual becomes a brand, a curated set of virtues that must be defended with a fierce, cold aggression to maintain a market value. The machinery of modern activism provides a sense of agency to the powerless, yet it leaves the actual structures of the world entirely unchanged. By focusing on the sin of the individual, the brain avoids the much harder work of addressing the complex, messy systems of human life. The digital mob is a collection of lonely people, each using the other to verify their own existence through a shared, loud, moral cry. The individual feels a rush of power when a villain is cast out, but the relief is short-lived, requiring a new target by morning. This is a biological trap where the dopamine of the win is tied to the destruction of a social bond, leaving the heart cold. The mask is now fused to the face, and the individual realizes they have no friends left, only a list of digital, moral allies. The safety of the high ground is a lonely peak, where the air is too thin for the warmth of a genuine, human touch. You are a master of a world that does not exist, a digital ghost haunting the ruins of a once shared and very messy reality. The cage is made of your own words, and the lock is the fear that you are just as flawed as the people you hate. The individual sits in the quiet of their room, feeling a hollow ache that no amount of public praise or moral victory can finally soothe. The excuses of the past begin to dissolve, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable sight of a person who has used others to feel meaningful and safe. The fix-it impulse arises instantly, urging the brain to find a new, even more radical cause to prove that this specific realization is actually growth. This is the final defensive layer, where the mind attempts to colonize its own awareness to maintain its status as the most conscious person in life. In a mirror, a man looks at his own tired eyes, realizing he has spent his life shouting at shadows to avoid looking at his own hands. The discomfort is deep and pervasive, a sign that the machinery of social dominance has finally run out of external targets to successfully and quietly consume. You are left with the crushing weight of your own virtue, a heavy monument built in a graveyard of broken and discarded human connections and hearts. Do not look for a way out, for the desire for a solution is just another attempt by the brain to regain a sense of total control. The realization is not a beginning, but a static state of being where you see the cage and the prisoner as the same, singular entity. A woman stops mid-sentence during a lecture, suddenly hearing the sharp, metallic sound of her own voice and the fear hiding within every single word. The audience waits for the point, but she realizes there is no point, only the vibration of a nervous system trying to survive its own deep isolation. The justifications you once held like a warm blanket now feel like a shroud, wrapping you in a cold, intellectualized, and very permanent state of exile. The unseen machinery of your activism is finally visible, but seeing the gears does not stop the clock from ticking toward a very lonely end. You are the architect of a world that is perfectly just and entirely empty, where every heart is monitored and every soul is a sterile, quiet room. The final insight is the most haunting, as you realize that the person you were trying to save was always just a younger, more terrified you. The mirror does not offer a new path, but only a reflection of a hunter who has finally cornered themselves in a room with no open doors. Stay with the coldness of the realization, for the search for warmth is the very thing that led you to build this frozen, moralistic, and loud fortress. There is no resolution for the ghost in the machine, only the quiet observation of the pattern as it continues to run in the dark, silent night. You are the observer of your own collapse, a spectator at the funeral of a mask that you can no longer bear to wear or discard. The loop remains open, the machinery continues to hum, and the high ground remains a lonely, barren peak where no one can ever truly reach you.